Hey everybody, welcome back to the SuperBake podcast. I'm your host, Baker. Let's talk about stuff. Hey everybody, welcome back to the SuperBake podcast. Well, as promised for quite a while now, I've finally gotten around to getting the review for Midnight Mass going, so yeah, I meant to get this done quite a bit sooner, but just life got in the way, but finally got it ready for you. So hopefully you like what you hear. The show's been out for a little while, so hopefully this convinces you to give it a try if you haven't watched it yet. So yeah, let's get to it. So first and foremost, Midnight Mass is a supernatural miniseries on Netflix, directed by Mike Flanagan. It released on September 24th, 2021. Also, just a fair warning, I am going to discuss the story of Midnight Mass in pretty great detail. I do feel like this is a show that you should experience knowing as little as possible about the plot before you go into it, so I'm going to try to avoid discussing some of the bigger events within the story. However, this will still contain pretty major spoilers, so just a heads up if you haven't seen it yet. I do strongly recommend going in blind. I just feel like the story and the beats within and also the character arcs will hit a lot. They'll hit a lot heavier if you don't know too much going into the story. So consider this the formal warning for that. It's all spoilers from here on out. So the story follows the character Riley Flynn, played by Zach Gilford, as he returns to his hometown on Crockett Island. After serving 4 years in prison for a fatal drunk driving accident, Riley is hoping to try to rebuild his life. I believe in the story he was originally like a pretty wealthy, just business guy who started up like a big tech company, and then he has the thing where he goes to prison, and then basically his entire fortune is just wiped out. So he's basically starting from nothing. He moves back in with his mom, his father, and his younger brother, and he also tries to rekindle his friendship with his old friend Aaron Green, played by Kate Siegel. From the Haunting of Hill House series. Hope that's how you pronounce her last name. The town of Crockett Island is a very small, fishing town, with just over I think it was something like 100, 120 people taking up residence on there, and very little contact with the main shore. Throughout the story, you see that they do have some interaction with them, but for the most part, the island's kind of in its own little world. So. One night while they're there, during a powerful storm, Riley sees what he believes to be the town's old pastor, Monsignor Pruitt. The priest seems to disappear in the storm when he goes after him, trying to see what's going on. And then after that, a young mysterious man named Father Paul Hill, played amazingly by Hamish Linklater, arrives to become the new priest at the town church, St. Patrick's Church. From there, strange and supernatural things begin to occur in the small town. The old and fledgling town seems to almost be revived by the arrival of the new young priest. The sick and injured are seemingly healed miraculously, and the old seem to age backwards, Benjamin Button style. And the young priest, Hill, seems to bear a striking resemblance to a picture of the older priest, Monsignor Pruitt, when he was in his youth. So the story itself is pretty standard, in my opinion, in terms of horror stories. Without going into too much detail, it's basically a vampire story. In many ways, this series feels very much like a Stephen King story. Actually, it's probably the most Stephen King story that's not actually from Stephen King. There's a couple reasons I think this. The first is that it's very character-driven. Riley is arguably the main character of the show. However, there is a decent-sized cast for the audience to latch on to. Of course, I mentioned Kate Siegel from before, but there's also a few other characters as well. There's the Sheriff Hassan, played by Raul Coley, I think is how you pronounce his last name. He's a Muslim sheriff who's trying to fit into the town while also keeping an open mind, and then also trying to instill many of his religious values and beliefs on his son. There's the character Bev Keane, played masterfully by the actress Samantha Sloyan, a highly zealous and often detestable member of the St. Patrick's Church, also a very influential person within the town on Crockett Island, as you'll see if you watch the show. And then the character Joe Colley, Robert Longstreet, who's played by Robert Longstreet, the town drunk, who starts off as kind of a seemingly insignificant character, but actually has a very surprising and powerful character arc in the story. And that's kind of one thing that I think it has in common with the Stephen King story, kind of going to use the story of It as an example, is that you always, with Stephen King, you always have these different characters with these different interesting perspectives and personalities to them. And then, of course, the fact that Joe Colley is the character of Joe Colley is a drunk, to me, harkens back to Stephen King, who pretty much, I think, every one of his stories always has like a alcoholic in it. The other reason why I think this is very similar to a Stephen King story is the fact that the story is moved along quite a bit by the dialogue. There are many scenes where characters just have conversations where we're given a look into their viewpoints on the world. Not just the events taking place on the island, but even on larger subjects surrounding, big subjects in life, like life, for example, or death. King's stories, I think, often have moments like this too, where characters they're given space to breathe and have interesting dialogues within the story. Midnight Mass does this as well, and quite effectively, in my opinion. And also, too, I think the other reason this is similar to a Stephen King story is because the conversations that take place in this story feel more theatrical and less realistic. These really feel more like conversations that you would expect to see in a play or a short story, not something that you would hear in real life, which is something I think King does quite a bit in his stories. Like, it just feels like the way characters talk in Stephen King's and his narratives and his books. The dialogue, he has like his own unique flavor of conversation in his stories that I just feel like you don't see in a lot of other stories, and you certainly don't see in a lot of other films or in real life. But yeah, as far as I'm aware, this is not from Stephen King, so I don't think this is related to any of his works. I think this is from my understanding, it's its own unique story, but it feels very much like a Stephen King adaptation. So if I didn't know better, I would have thought that for sure. And then as far as the story goes, there's really two horror stories that take place in Midnight Mass. The first is the obvious, more in-your-face supernatural story with the new priest Paul Hill and the strange occurrences that begin happening on the island after his arrival. There is a monster in this series, just to kind of get that out of the way right now, which I'm sure you've probably heard about. So it's described as an angel by Paul, but essentially it's a vampire. They don't come right out and say it, but I mean, I think that's pretty obvious what it is. You can kind of think of it as like a modern-day Nosferatu, in a sense. The creature stays mostly in the shadows throughout the majority of the story. It is more and more of it is revealed as you get later into the later episodes, but for the most part, it stays pretty much in the shadows. There are some scenes with it that are genuinely unnerving. It's mostly when they first introduce it and you don't really get a good look at it. And those scenes are definitely pretty good, but in my opinion, that's not where the show is at its best. While the reveal of the vampire is definitely interesting, it's not what I would consider to be the biggest selling point of this show. That would be the second story that takes place in here. The second story is the more subtextual element happening in the background. A major theme of Midnight Mass is mob mentality, and how people can be easily swayed by persuasive individuals. So once the priest Paul arrives at the town, several quote-unquote miracles begin to occur that nobody in the town can explain at first. However, once the town, and more specifically the character Bev, again played by Samantha Sloyan, start to figure out what's going on, it begins to take a very different and much darker turn. Mob mentality starts to kick in as the town is seemingly brainwashed by Bev, and not only do they accept the supernatural things that are happening, they actually embrace them openly as a new kind of, religion almost. From there, things get violent and bloody real quick. In my opinion, the show handles the subject of mob mentality extremely well. The way the town is persuaded by the character Bev is done in a way where it doesn't feel like it's beating you over the head. Bev, and just to kind of give some background on her character, she is, as I said before, a very highly persuasive character in the town. In the town church, she basically is the person that works very closely with the priest, with Paul Hill in the situation. And she is a highly religious person. She's also a teacher at the local school, I think the two teachers. The other one, of course, is the one, Aaron Green, played by Kate Siegel. But Bev's character is definitely and she also feels like a Stephen King type character, but she's highly religious, is constantly quoting passages from the Bible. And later in the show, as we see, she uses her religious views as ways to justify some of the decisions that she makes, many of them being, highly deplorable decisions. I mean, she's, like I said, a despicable, detestable person who tries to use her religious beliefs as sort of like an excuse to behave in the way that she does. If you watch this show, I think you'll understand what I mean by that. But basically, she begins to slowly convince the town that the Reverend Paul is their savior and that the miracles happening on Crockett Island are basically the will of God himself. Of course, the town buys into this idea wholeheartedly, and we see the terrifying effects this begins to have on the citizens. In my opinion, this is where the show really starts to shine. This is a horror story, of course, so with that in mind, probably the first question you're asking is it scary? Well, to be honest, I think that will really depend on your own personal definition of what scary is. If you're the kind of person that gets more uncomfortable with monster stories, then the vampire elements might scare you a bit. I personally didn't find the scenes with the angel/vampire to be that scary, but I could see where some people might. To me, I think the scariest scenes are the ones where we begin to see the town lose its collective mind as they're persuaded by Bev to follow the words of the priest. We see the horrifying results of this and the bloody conclusion that it leads to. This is where the show really starts to get under your skin. Obviously, this is done up for dramatic effect, and I'd like to believe that in real life this wouldn't happen so easily, but who knows. But it's the idea that someone you've known your entire life could one day become a monster, both literally and figuratively in this case, and try to kill you. Now, I have heard this show has been pretty divisive amongst viewers. Some people, like myself, loved it and greatly enjoyed every moment of it, but I have heard a few criticisms about this show, one of which is that it contains a lot of monologues. And yes, there is a lot of talking in Midnight Mass. Let's just go ahead and get that out of the way right now. Yes, there are a lot of scenes where characters are just talking. We see moments in the show where there's really no action taking place, just a back and forth between two or more characters. And yes, these scenes do take up a lot of screen time throughout the series. However, at least in my opinion, this is where the show is really at its absolute best. I mean, I've said this before in earlier podcasts, but I actually like it when shows can just slow down and let the audience breathe in a little bit and just take it in. The scenes in Midnight Mass where we get to listen to the different perspectives of these characters, to me, works to flesh them out and make them feel more like actual people. Yes, the conversations aren't really what I'd consider to be that realistic, but they help to make the characters feel more like characters and not just plot devices. These are people with history and different ideologies, and we get to experience those in their dialogue. And again, it helps to move the story along. It's not just padding, which I think is something that a lot of shows are guilty of, where they have dialogue, but it doesn't really serve the story. It's really just kind of there to justify the hour-long runtime. And one fantastic example of this in the show is when the characters Riley and Aaron have a conversation about death. They just talk about what they believe happens when you die. This is something that I'm sure a lot of people have probably thought about at some point in their life. I think it's something that we don't often talk about very much, but it's certainly a thought that we have from time to time. And just listening to these two people give their 2 cents on what they think happens when you pass on, to me, was a real highlight for this show. Erin's idea of death is more of a hopeful religious view where we learn that she hopes to be reunited with her loved ones, including, and this is a pretty major point in the story, her daughter that she loses. And she has this, her belief is that when she dies, she'll be reunited with her daughter and everyone that she's lost and that she cares about, and that she'll achieve kind of a oneness with the universe. And as she describes it, that's kind of her idea of what it truly means to be with God. So it's this very hopeful, optimistic view of death. And Riley, on the other hand, and again, this is a character who earlier in the story we see was involved in a fatal drunk driving accident where he was the person who caused the death of somebody else because of his intoxication while being behind the wheel. And it's a wonderful plot element in the story where we can see that he is being haunted by the visions of this accident that happened. And it's something that's just been plaguing him throughout the entire story. And so because of that, Riley has more of an agnostic view of death, where he believes that he simply will cease to exist. As he puts it, all the endorphins and dopamines in his brain will all fire off at once, and he'll have the last best dream ever before finally fading into nothing. This scene is so effective because it shows us not just the viewpoints of these characters, but it also gives us a broader idea of the overall story of Midnight Mass. A major element of this show is faith versus science. There are scenes where we see the town doctor taking a blood test that contains the vampire's blood, and she sees it evaporate in the sunlight. Well, later she tries to make sense of this by comparing it to other medical or known medical diseases with similar symptoms. This same character tries to make sense of the other miracles that are taking place in the town. She tries to view it from a scientific perspective, while other characters such as Bev simply look at it as a sign from God. Who's right and who's wrong is ultimately left open for the audience to decide. We're never really given a definitive answer on this, and the show just allows us to draw our own conclusions on that front. Yes, we know there's a vampire monster, and that's a big part of the story, but we don't really know where it came from. Its origins are never really truly explained to the audience, so we don't know very much about it. I think this was a good idea on the writer's part. The focus is less on the monster and more on the effects the monster and his powers have on the town. It's really more or less, how do the people in Crockett Island respond to this creature and the influence that it has on them. To me, that's the focus of the show, and that to me is where the show is at its best. Another great scene with these great moments of dialogue is from Sheriff Hassan, where he has a conversation with the town doctor later. This is where she's basically trying to convince him. She basically tells him about her findings and wants to try to convince him to assist her on this. And of course, he's understandably, a little bit hesitant. And he kind of explains to her why he gives her some of his history and why he came to Crockett Island, despite the townspeople, especially the character of Bev, not being the most open-minded individuals. Again, we're given this deep look into this character and his history prior to the story that's taking place. This is a great moment where we get to see that this is a person, not just some character in a show. The sheriff is an ordinary man just trying to make his way through life, instill his values on his son, but also try to adapt to the changing world around him. We get to experience that in this great dialogue that he has with the doctor, and scenes like this in Midnight Mass are what make it great to me. With all these positives I've stated, I don't want it to sound like I think this show is perfect. There are definitely flaws I have with this series. While I don't consider them big enough to really bring it down, they were some things that I noticed and kind of kept me from enjoying it as much as I would have liked. I kind of feel like this show has a similar problem with A Quiet Place, the movie with John Krasinski. Both have a problem, in my opinion, where the more you think about the plot, the more you kind of start to poke holes in it. One issue I had was that once the first miracle occurs, the town seems way too quick to accept it. So basically, what happens in the town is that they soon find out that the new priest, Paul Hill, he is the old priest that left, Monsignor Pruitt. He was an old man when he left the town, and he went to Jerusalem. And while there, he goes into a cave and runs in, and that's where he encounters the angel. The angel attacks him and then gives him its blood. And then this is a huge plot element of the story. The angel's blood has healing effects. And not just healing effects, it can actually reverse aging. So Monsignor Pruitt, despite being an old man, when he takes in the angel's blood, or the vampire's blood, he's restored. His youth is restored. He's a young man again. And I think in that part of the story, he's kind of suffering from Alzheimer's or dementia, and that's cured as well. And so basically he comes back to the town, somehow brings the vampire with him, and then basically he is mixing the vampire blood with the communion so that other people will drink it. And so anybody who drinks it, essentially, like most of their physical ailments just disappear. And so an example of this is at one point in the story, there's a character who's been paralyzed from the waist down for several years. And then after drinking some of the vampire's blood in the wine at the church, she's suddenly healed and she can walk again. The townspeople are understandably shocked by this, but it doesn't really seem like anyone really gives it that much attention, at least not as much as it deserves. I feel like something like this happening would be much bigger news, would be a way bigger deal, and would most likely make national news because it would be considered a medical miracle. But in the show, it just kind of feels like, yeah, the town is initially shocked that she can walk, and then they're happy, but then it kind of feels like it just sort of gets brushed aside pretty quickly. Now, granted, this does lead to a pretty powerful and heartfelt moment between the girl and the town drunk, Joe Collins, that I mentioned earlier, which I'll kind of let you see for yourself, as I do think that that's a great scene that is best viewed when you don't know about it, or at least don't know the details of it. But I just kind of feel like this was a scene where, if this were to happen in real life, this would be a much bigger deal, and it just kind of felt like nobody really paid that much attention to it. It's like this character who was suddenly paralyzed can walk again, and it just feels like it was sort of, no one really gave it that much attention. So another aspect of the story that I guess I didn't quite fully understand was how the vampire got to the island in the first place. Maybe I missed it, and maybe I need to go back and watch the show again, but I believe there was a scene where the priest Pruitt, Monsignor Pruitt and Paul Hill were the same people. It's basically revealed that his name is actually Paul Pruitt, because he is Monsignor Pruitt. But it's like, he says like he had to bribe someone in customs, but it's like, I can't imagine customs would just let you bring a vampire into the U.S. So unless it flew over here from Jerusalem, I guess I don't really understand quite how it got here. But I guess that's kind of a minor detail. I guess the point is that it's here. But that was something that I was kind of curious about, was how did you get it into the U.S.? If customs freaks out over, because I've worked with U.S. customs before, and if they won't let you bring in a container because it's got foreign beetles in it, I can't imagine they'd let you bring in a vampire. But whatever. Also, and then another big issue I had with the story was, once the truth is revealed to the townspeople, it seems like they just sort of accept it. So towards the end of the series, there's a scene where basically a lot of people, including Bev, kind of figure out that Monsignor Pruitt and the new priest Paul are basically the same person. And she kind of figures out what's going on. She figures out that there's a vampire and that the vampire's blood is actually healing people. And so she kind of comes on board with it as well. But then they try to convince the other townspeople of what's going on too, and it feels like most of the people in the town kind of just agree to it, just without too much pushback. There's a scene near the end where basically a lot of churchgoers agree to drink this poison and kill themselves so they can essentially be reborn as vampires. Because in the show, basically, they explain it where if you get the vampire's blood in your system and then you die, you'll basically be reborn as a vampire. And so a lot of people in the church decide they just kind of go along with it. Again, I'll give the characters the benefit of the doubt, and that before that they had literally witnessed actual miracles happening, so that could obviously sway their opinions. But I can't say I would do the same thing. I would still be very skeptical, and I would not go along with it. I don't drink poison. Sorry, Bev. I guess since it's only an 8-episode series, maybe it had to be that way for the sake of time, but I have a hard time believing anyone would just go along with it that easily. And I mean, honestly, in the grand scheme of things, I guess it's not that distracting. It just seems kind of odd to me that they just were so willing to just go along with it. Because it's like, okay, even if what Bev and Father Pruitt are telling you is true, like, you don't know what's going to happen if you turn into a vampire. Like, how do you know you're not just going to go on a killing spree and slaughter everyone around you? Like, I don't know, it's kind of an interesting thought process. I'm not sure I quite get it, but whatever, to each their own, I suppose. Maybe everybody in the town secretly wanted to be a vampire. I'm not sure. But yeah, I mean, those are just a few things that I kind of had, or a few issues I had with the plot. But I mean, overall, they weren't that big a deal. Just some things that I'd kind of noticed. And once I thought about it more and more, they just kind of, again, kind of like with A Quiet Place, it kind of felt like they sort of added up after a while. Because A Quiet Place, I think that was kind of a similar problem too, is where the more you thought about the fact that they couldn't make any sound, it's like, well, then how did you make all this work? But regardless, yeah, I don't feel like these negatives aspects that I've described of the show really brought it down too much for me, but just some things that I personally noticed about it. So overall, if I had to give a score for the show, I would say probably an 8.8 out of 10. I would definitely recommend giving this series a try. It's a one-shot series, to my understanding. I don't believe there's going to be a second season, and I think that's probably for the best. I don't think this is one of those shows that would really benefit from multiple seasons. And again, the way it kind of wraps up, I mean, it feels pretty final to me. I mean, it's left. There are some elements, at least one that's left kind of open ended. But I mean, unless you're going to do it in a different location, I don't really see how you could do a sequel to this. But personally, as far as I'm aware, there's no plans to do another season of this show, and I think that's really for the best. To me, this works as better as just like a one-off, like movie, like TV miniseries or something like that. So yeah, I'm glad there's not going to be, at least right now, I'm glad there's no plans for a second season. I think they should just keep it that way. A few positives of this show. I would say number one, phenomenal acting, especially from the actors Hamish Linklater and Samantha Sloyan as Father Paul Pruitt and Beverly Keene, respectively. These two were just fantastic, especially Samantha as Bev. Bev, to me, was probably the best character in the story just because of how despicable she was. She was such a despicable, hateable human being. Like, every scene she's in, she just completely owns the scene. Like, Samantha just completely knocks it out of the park with this role. I looked her up and I've seen her in other things. I know she had like a small role, like I think in Grey's Anatomy. I know she's been in other shows as well, but yeah, she was fantastic in this. Just the scenes with her character are just chilling at times. Just the coldness, the callousness of her character. There's a scene in the beginning of the series where she poisons Joe Collin, the town drunk's dog, because she just doesn't like him, because she thinks that it's a vicious dog, even though it never attacked anybody. And so she basically poisons him, and it's this really gut-wrenching scene, and where you can see Joe is, crying over his lost friend, and she's literally just standing over him with just this callous, just unflinching look on her face, and just, yeah, the scenes with her are just fantastic. And then, of course, her character does get her comeuppance in the end of the story, which is so, so satisfying. One of the most satisfying things ever. And then Hamish Linklater, I mean, I know he's been in other things too. He was in, I think, The Big Short with Steve Carell. Didn't know a whole lot about him. Again, kind of like with Samantha, a relatively unknown actor, at least for me. But yeah, I mean, I'll have to keep an eye out for him in upcoming productions because he definitely is one of the highlights of this show for sure. His acting in this he has a lot of range for sure, because he starts off as like this, pretty warm, welcoming individual, but he kind of runs the gamut from like being nice and open and friendly to being kind of off-putting and awkward, and even at times like kind of menacing and sort of a weird kind of feeblish kind of way, where it's like he doesn't seem like he's that threatening, but it almost kind of seems like he brings with him like the threat, which I guess in this situation is the vampire. But his acting in this is just great, and the way he stammers in many scenes, like almost like he himself is kind of doubting what he's saying. It's a great little detail in his acting in this show. Another positive, very well written dialogue, as I've touched on before. It can be lengthy at times, but to me, it serves to move the story along. And I feel like, again, this almost kind of feels like a theater production or Broadway, where it's like this dialogue it's these characters given time and space to really kind of use the scenery and to use the story and to add to it. It has a purpose. It adds to the narrative, and I think it does so very effectively. Another positive, great character arcs. The character of Riley, I love his story. There's a great kind of a surprise towards the halfway in the story with his character, which I'm not going to spoil for you because, again, like I've said before with some of the other reveals, I think not knowing about it's going to be much better. It's going to have a much greater impact if you don't know about it. But it's this very powerful moment between him and Aaron, and the character of Aaron, and it's a gut-wrenching moment too, because as it's revealed in the story, he is haunted by images of the girl that he killed. He's literally haunted by her from the drunk driving accident, where every night when he tries to go to sleep, he keeps seeing her haunting him. And whether or not it's actually her spirit haunting him or just images in his mind, his own guilt doing it to him, we don't really know. It's never really fully revealed to us. but it's these great haunting moments within the story. There's no dialogue. There's really nothing happening. It's just the girl watching him as he sleeps, and she's still mangled and destroyed from, and torn up from the crash. And it's this really powerful, effective moment within the story. And it happens a few times, and it's really, yeah, it's one of those things where it's like it's super creepy. It's almost kind of tough to watch, but you don't want to look away. So his arc is great. Of course, the arc, again, like I said before, with Joe Colley, I think I called him Collins before. Joe Colley, the drunk, his character arc with the girl who was paralyzed before is great. Bev Keene's character, I mean, her arc just throughout the entire show from the first episode to the last one. I mean, the way she goes from being this kind of annoying, bitchy character to actually being like a real, truly threatening leader, an influencer in the story is done masterfully. And of course, Reverend Paul Pruitt, his arc as well is fantastic. There's he actually has bigger ties to the town other than just the fact that he's the priest, the old priest who's come back young again, who's had his youth restored. There's a great connection between him and the town doctor that's revealed later on, which is just it's near the second or it's either the last episode or the second to last episode where their relationship is kind of revealed, and man, it's hard to watch, but it's great. And just the way his arc, he kind of goes from being sort of a suspicious, almost kind of villainous type character to becoming almost kind of sort of an anti-hero by the end of the story. The way it's played up is just fantastic. I loved his character so much. At first, I wasn't sure if I liked his character, but by the end, I loved him. He was one of the best characters in the show, in my opinion. Like I said, I'm just going to go ahead and say this now. The two best characters in the show are definitely Bev and Reverend Pruitt. Like, to me, no contest. Those are the two best characters in the show. Well, maybe three. The sheriff as well. I love the sheriff's character. Just every scene he was in was fantastic. Another positive, the cinematography in the show was fantastic. Just some of the shots are just absolutely mesmerizing. So, like, for example, there's this scene with Riley where and again, it's the scene where he's on a boat, and I'm just going to leave it at that. And it's a big scene for him. You'll know it when you see it, but the scene, the way it's shot is just so amazing. And then there's a scene towards the end of the show where the townspeople, when a lot of them, after they're turned into vampires and they're walking, throughout the town, and when the light hits them just right, you can see like there's kind of a glare on their eyes. And it only happens when they're turned into vampires, and it's kind of one of the show's big tells to show you like who's a vampire and who's not. You can see it in their eyes when it's nighttime. You can kind of see their eyes have sort of like almost a glow to them, kind of like it's almost kind of like I don't know what you would call it, but just the way the light reflects off of their pupils. And it's super eerie and creepy, but the way it works and the way you see them walking through the town, almost like zombies, but they're intelligent. Like they're basically people who have been brainwashed, and it's haunting to watch, but it's so great. Just a couple negatives of the show. I would say some situations felt a little far-fetched. Like, I just kind of found it difficult to believe that most people would just go along with something like this. Again, the idea that, like, once the vampire's revealed and the town kind of knows what's really going on, a lot of them, I mean, yeah, there are the ones that do resist, obviously, but it seems like a lot of people just kind of go along with it, and they're just kind of like, okay, well, we're just going to be vampires. So it's like, I get it. I guess the idea is supposed to be that they're brainwashed, and it's supposed to be, again, like I said before, it's supposed to be kind of a play against, or a play on, mob mentality. So I get that, and I get the purpose behind it, but it just kind of seemed a little like, I don't know, I have a hard time believing that people would just be that quick to do that. It's a pretty extreme thing that happens towards the end of the story, so... and then another negative was it did feel like in some situations, or some scenes, it felt like they dragged a little at times. And again, I think a lot of this is because of the dialogue. Sometimes the dialogue would make some scenes go on longer than what I personally felt was necessary. Not to say that I wish the dialogue was shorter, but maybe, I don't know, maybe there were some scenes that I guess maybe they felt like they could have trimmed it just a little bit. Again, like the big scenes, I think that's fine to have the big dialogue. Like again, the conversation between Riley's character and Aaron when they're talking about death. That was a big scene, and I think the dialogue in there is perfect. Leave it as it is, don't change it. But it did feel like there were some scenes where, especially towards the end of the show, where characters would spend, a lot of time talking about what was happening as opposed to actually doing something about it. And again, this is kind of after the majority of the town, they get turned into vampires. And there's a scene where basically they're going around destroying buildings in the town because they want everybody to come to the church. So the church will be the one place they can go to, which, of course, not to give too much away, it backfires on them horribly. And they just kind of sit around talking about it as opposed to like, well, couldn't you guys be doing something like putting out the fire, trying to save the buildings or, trying to find some way to, protect yourselves when the sun inevitably comes up. It's like, I don't know, just some moments like that where I kind of felt like the show just sort of meandered a little bit and maybe it could have moved a little bit more in terms of like just narratively speaking. But yeah. And overall, like I said before, I would recommend this show. I do think it is a bit of an acquired taste, however. It's not a typical scary movie / show where, where it's kind of obvious like what's going on. So and also there's, the payoff is big towards the end, but you have to kind of be patient with it. I think that's a big thing about this show is it's going to require a lot of patience from the viewer. But I think if you give it a shot and just really allow yourself to get immersed in the story and just soak up the dialogue and the atmosphere, I really think you'll enjoy it. Like I said, I recommend this show. I personally highly enjoyed it and definitely would recommend it for sure. And not just as something to watch around Halloween, but just in general. I think it's just in general a well-written show and phenomenally acted. So if for nothing else, watch it for the acting for sure. So, all right, guys, I think that's going to conclude my review of Midnight Mass. I hope you enjoyed what I had to say about it, and hopefully I've persuaded some of you to check it out if you were on the fence before. So, I will catch you guys next time. Later.